Okay. So the question, who is God? I kind of pushed it off last week. It seemed kind of daunting to speak about God. And I think that's in some ways appropriate to feel some intimidation about speaking about God. So let me just sort of say some basic things about a Jewish concept of God. Jews believe in one God. That's really important. Meaning a God who is not physical, a God who has no body, so that's sort of not just unique, not just one, but indivisible, okay, and not physical. The one who kind of really wrote about and sort of developed the Jewish concept of God and with like sort of philosophical rigor for the first time was Maimonides, who was maybe the first to kind of treat Jewish philosophy with a lot of rigor in many, many topics. And Maimonides points out in a number of his writings that God's incorporeality, God's lack of a body, is linked to God's unity. That anything with a body and God's perfection and God's unity and God's not having a body are all three assertions that are one necessarily causes the other, right? If God had a body, God couldn't be indivisible, right? And God couldn't be unique right? Because things that have bodies are only distinguished from one another by their bodies, right? So God's not having a body and right are all connected. And this is either one finds this type of medieval philosophy compelling or not. It's philosophy has developed since the Middle Ages when Maimonides wrote these things, but his impact on Jewish thought has been quite profound and has persisted. I think the challenges, though, are several. One, the character of God in the Hebrew Bible seems to have a body. The Bible uses all sorts of bodily imagery when describing God. It speaks about God's body, God's hand, speaks about God having all sorts of human traits. So for Maimonidean, we have to say that these are metaphors. And so every time the Bible uses this language, it's a metaphor. And the question is, why is it using this language? To teach us something about God or something about us, how we are supposed to emulate God. We're supposed to emulate God's behaviors, and so the descriptions of God in the Bible are not descriptions of God as God actually is, which is beyond definition, beyond the ability of human language, but are meant to be educational. Right? Just as God is referred to as being merciful, just as God is referred to as being feeding the hungry, so too we should be merciful and feed the hungry and clothe the naked and care for the poor. We emulate God's actions and the words, the character traits by which God is referred to in Scripture are guides for our own behavior. We're supposed to emulate God and walk in God's ways, which walking in God's ways means modeling and molding our character to be more godlike. But for Maimonidean, we're not actually describing God, we're not actually defining God. That's impossible for Maimonidean. There's also another, so that's one sort of challenge that Maimonidean, sort of very pure, austere, philosophical understanding of God poses. We have to kind of reconcile that with the language and all the sort of very rich imagery of the Bible. One of my teachers said, God has an arm. We have metaphors, which I thought was a very clever way of kind of reversing. It's not that, when the Torah refers to God's hand as a metaphor, so maybe reverse it. It's not that God's hand is the metaphor, right? We have metaphor. God is a real hand, right? In other words, God's actions, God's powers is real. Ours is only like the metaphoric shadow of God's power. The other stronger challenge, I think, that comes from this philosophically pure concept of God is God's perfection implies that God doesn't change, which means that nor does God need anything. Which means that God doesn't God doesn't respond to prayer. Right? When we pray, God isn't answering our prayer. God isn't listening to or responding to our prayer. God won't change God's mind based on our prayers, nor is God happy when we do mitzvot, because God can't have emotional reactions to our actions. If He did, that would be a negation of God's perfection. A perfect being doesn't change. A perfect being isn't affected by what we do. And Maimonides constructs a whole philosophy of Judaism based on these predicates. And indeed, for Maimonides, if you think that doing mitzvot makes God happy, that's idolatry. That's a pagan. Pagans think that way. That's inconsistent with monotheism, right? If you think that way, you're a goner, okay? For Maimonides. And I think, there's a certain philosophical rigor that, however, it makes sort of religion a little bit challenging. So, Maimonides wrote a book called The Guide for the Perplexed, in which he explains how religion can be meaningful and sustainable given these philosophical predicates of a God who is perfect, who can't move, who isn't affected, who doesn't change God's mind. And so the mitzvot are about building a balanced life and an ordered society. They create stable interactions among people for a good social order, for a balanced life, and that's what the mitzvot do. They don't make God change His mind. God can't change. And prayer isn't effective because it causes God to change His mind. Maybe prayer changes the mind of the prayer. Maybe the individual is elevated through prayer, and that can change your circumstances in life, like by the way that prayer transforms the prayer, but prayer wouldn't change God for a Maimonidean. So this works for you. That's great, and you can read Maimonides and see how that works. What's really wonderful about Maimonides is he wrote this book of philosophy, kind of reconciling Judaism and biblical faith with Western philosophy, Aristotle, etc. He also wrote one of the greatest codes of Jewish law, the Mishnah Torah, which is like a completely systemic, well-organized, beautifully written guide to Jewish life. Right? He thought he wanted to replace the Talmud. The Talmud is very hard to read. It's very challenging book. And Maimonides thought, instead of spending years and years trying to understand the Talmud, I'll write a book that's very clear, tells you what to do, it tells you what to, and all the things you have to know. Will be in this book. Plus, you have a Hebrew Bible, you have a Tanakh, and you have my book, and you won't need anything else. And that's what he. So the book wasn't used that way. Has not been used that way, but it still is a very popular, very important book, and all of the pieces fit together in a beautiful way. In other words, his development of Jewish law, his presentation of Jewish law, is informed by and informs his philosophical system. So if that works for you, that's great. But I have a friend and a colleague who said to me that at one point in his life, he sort of decided for himself that his need for a more vibrant and rich prayer life was more important than a certain philosophical rigor for him. And so the Maimonidean God made it hard for him to pray. The Maimonidean God was crippling to his spiritual life, and he felt even though he found it, I think, compelling in certain ways philosophically, and that was more important to him to have like a vibrant, rich, real spiritual life, including a more central role for petitionary prayer, where we ask God for things, where we talk to God, where we communicate with God, we have a relationship with God, an emotional relationship with God, where we are worshiping a God who has emotions or responds emotionally to us, and that type of religious life was more important to him than being able to have a relationship with God that would correspond to his own philosophical predicates. So that was very influential to me, and I think I guess I can appreciate what Maimonides accomplished, but I don't feel bound, I don't feel constrained by it in trying to construct a spiritual life. And certainly the more dominant Jewish spiritual stance is to be in relationship with God in a way where God is in fact much more emotional in some capacity. I still think it's good to kind of have that corrective balance of Maimonides, not to create a God in our own image, right? Not to be worshiping a man with a long white beard or whatever it might be, like not to allow images or our prejudices to color our image of God, not to fall into a kind of superstitious stance where we're controlling God, manipulating God through our actions, but at the same time, I think when we pray, we can really approach God with a stance that God is interested in your relationship with us. Or Soloveitchik, in some of his writings on prayer, speaks of prayer as being something that we couldn't have imagined doing were it not for the fact that it's a mitzvah. Right? If it wasn't for the fact that our legal system commands us to pray, it would be preposterous for a human being to approach God and address God. But what can we do? Like it's there. We're told to do it by our tradition, and that gives us a space to stand before God and approach God and speak to God. So that understanding accepts the paradox of prayer, but it maybe also fuels the possibility, or makes space for the possibility of a more lively, vibrant prayer life. Any questions on what I said so far?
So Maimonides approached doing mitzvah by that's what he was told to do, not by. Did he feel that he felt that it would improve himself, it would improve the world around him, but he wasn't. He didn't feel that it would impact God at all.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. Right.
He felt that it would.
God is perfect. God doesn't need anything from anyone, including us. So God doesn't need our mitzvot. And so the mitzvot were given to us in order to perfect the world and to perfect us. But God doesn't need it.
Did Rabbi Soloveitchik feel he didn't feel it that way?
He was strongly influenced by Maimonides, strongly influenced by Maimonides, so I would say more on that side than on the other side, probably. Yeah. I mean, I think he had. You could read. I mean,
yeah.
You could read his writings. You could try to unpack them and come to your own decision. The alternative position, there's the Kabbalistic position, which is that in the act of creation, somehow God was, in some way, if you could speak of such a thing, God was somehow fragmented, right? The Kabbalists ask the question, how can there be room for a finite universe if existence contains an infinite God? Where can you fit the world? Where can you fit the universe?
Two souls, right?
I don't know that. I don't know.
Oh, our soul and then the fragment of God. The Kabbalistic view.
I'm about to explain my understanding of the Kabbalistic view, but you should really ask the Kabbalists. But my sense is that they ask the question, how can there be room for the universe in a existence that contains an infinite God? There's no space for the universe to fit if God is infinite. And so the Kabbalistic answer, there are at least two versions of this, is that in the act of creation, God engaged in something called tzimtzum, withdrawing into God's self, and in so doing, made room for the universe to exist. In that act of tzimtzum and then creation, vessels were kind of, there were these vessels through which godliness kind of infused the universe. These vessels were shattered in the act of creation. And so for the Kabbalists, when we do mitzvot, we are elevating these shards, these fragments of the vessels that were broken during creation. In this way, we're repairing some celestial edifice on a different plane. And in that sense, God could be said to need our mitzvot in a Kabbalistic understanding. So it's sort of a messianic thrust of Kabbalistic life, because if you do mitzvot, you're perfecting, tikkun olam, you're repairing the world on this celestial, mystical level, leading to some ultimate perfection that will unfold. The Hasidic movement kind of, according to many, neutralized that messianic fervent and turned it inward, that it's made that focus on perfecting the self rather than perfecting the world. Two schools of this Kabbalistic thought, or one major alternative, the Hasidic, some of the Hasidic Kabbalists said that God's tzimtzum was only epistemological but not ontological. It was apparent withdrawal. It wasn't inward, withdrawal, but not actual. And that's either a major difference between the Hasidic thinking and what came before it, or not. And that's something that people other than me can speak about with greater authority. If that interests you, I can give you readings about that if that question interests you. So in terms of a concept of just one more thing I'll just say about God, about prayer, and then I'll say one more thing about God after that, and then if you have any questions, you can ask them. There's a Christian philosopher, C.S. Lewis, who I think wrote a very thoughtful essay about prayer, and he says that you can make an objection to prayer and say, how could petitionary prayer be effective, since God has the power to make whatever God wants to occur in the universe, and therefore if God wanted it to happen, it would happen without your prayer, and if God doesn't want it to happen, your prayer won't make it happen. You understand the challenge, right? I'm not going to pray for good weather, right? Good weather will either happen or not, tomorrow. Good weather, will or won't rain tomorrow, because God wants it to rain or doesn't want it to rain, and why should I pray? So he points out that that same argument can be made for any human action. If I'm going to build a house, right? Why should my endeavor in building a house have any be effective? If God wants the house to be built, it can be built without me, and if God doesn't want the house to be built, my efforts won't be effective in making the house built. And so why should it, and yet somehow we seem to live in a universe with causality, and that's this great, for some reason God created a universe where human initiative, has apparent impact and seems to cause things to occur in the world. And even though there's sort of that paradox of why that should be, okay, whatever reason it is, that's how God willed the universe to exist, where human initiative seems to have an impact and make a difference in the world. And once you understand that, really prayer and anything else that we do aren't really different. They all have that paradox exists for all of them, and therefore our actions can have an impact, whether we're praying or whether we're doing some other type of initiative. So those are very clever and helpful observation to make. I think for many Jews, our connection to the Torah is a lot more real than our relationship with God. Since God has no body and can't be seen, one of the sort of closest ways in which we can come and have proximity to God or be in God's orbit is through our connection to the Torah, which is God's will. And so, through studying Torah, and discovering things about the Torah, we are having a relationship with God's will, which is as close as many of us can get with having a direct relationship with God. I think Jewish spiritual life, maybe that may explain why Torah study has such a large role in not only in Jewish intellectual life, but in Jewish spiritual life, which isn't to deny that, all sorts of other paths towards relationship with God, which people have, which are important and valuable, but I think Torah study is there as well, even though which is, I think, a distinctly Jewish, spiritual approach. Study as a kind of spiritual practice, I think, is maybe something that wouldn't be found outside of Judaism. Let's say something about, do men and women, or we do Mashiach? What's next? Any questions, comments, concerns so far what I said? Okay. Okay, we'll do men and women, okay? The Torah, as understood, how would I say this? Now, Orthodox Judaism has confers on men and women different legal statuses. There are mitzvot that are obligatory upon men only. There are mitzvot that are obligatory upon women only. And then there are mitzvot that require a man and a woman, like marriage and divorce, and some others as well as prohibitions that require a man and a woman. Okay, so men and women are different. The genders have distinct halachic statuses, legal statuses in Jewish law, as it's described in the Torah, and as it is, as the rabbis in the Talmud understand it, and as later legal scholars have developed it. So I guess we can sort of mention some of those differences. Although they'll be apparent if if you spend time in this community or any other Orthodox community, it'll become apparent, and I'll say something about it. So the quorum for public prayer is 10 men, and as we understand Jewish law, it's only men who make up that quorum. Men wear tefillin or phylacteries during morning prayers on the weekdays, and women generally do not. There are most of the prayer leadership roles are also taken only by men. There are certain ritual roles which traditionally were performed by men, but women can do them in fact in equal fashion as men, like reciting Kiddush on Shabbat. I would say the burdens of observing Hilchot Midah, all of the regulations of mikveh use pertaining to married life. Most of those burdens fall upon women, although men certainly, the husbands certainly need to be involved and supportive and aware of the process in order to be successful. The question is, what to make of these differences, and how significant are they, and what is their significance? In fact, the total number of mitzvot where men and women have different, relate to those different obligations, it's maybe a dozen, maybe 2 dozen out of 613. So it's a fairly small percentage of the Torah's mitzvot where men and women have different obligations. They're important, right? Especially in communal life, they're important, but they also shouldn't be blown out of proportion in terms of the number of mitzvot. The Torah has 613 mitzvot, 613 commandments. The vast majority of them are obligatory to men and women equally, and it's a relatively small number, maybe several dozen, that have different rules for men and women. So what's to make of it? So here you have a couple of different, a spectrum of how to relate to these differences. You have one group of one pole on this spectrum, which takes these differences, these gender differences, and constructs from them a philosophy of Jewish womanhood, in which men and women have sort of, at a very fundamental level, have different religious identities, are meant to cultivate different relationships with God, and to have different roles in the community, wherein most of the public ritual roles, communal prayer, public rituals pertaining to prayer, etc., devolve upon men, and women have a responsibility for cultivating the religious environment in the home. And so you have two spheres. You have the synagogue and you have the home. These are the two areas in which Jewish life perpetuates itself, and one is the domain of men and one is the domain of women, even though each has a role to play in the other. And that's certainly, so the more traditional Orthodox communities, I think, have done that. They've constructed a philosophy of Jewish womanhood based on these, different roles in this way. The other end of the spectrum looks at these differences. Okay, we have a small number of technical legal differences where men have certain obligations that women don't. And what that means is that men are obligated to these mitzvot and women aren't. But we're not going to build a philosophy based on that. We're not going to make assumptions about things that beyond what the data calls for. And even these mitzvot that women are obligated to perform, women are welcome to perform these mitzvot in most cases, right? And in some cases, for 1,000 years, women have taken something. So it's the Talmud says women are exempt from the mitzvah of hearing the shofar in Rosh Hashanah, but for 1,000 years we have a record of women taking this mitzvah very seriously and going to great lengths to make sure they hear the shofar in Rosh Hashanah. For example, it's like a 1,000-year-old example, and there are more, and there are more modern examples. I think women are exempt from the mitzvah of sitting in a sukkah on the holiday of Sukkot, but and I think 70 years ago, when Jews lived in dense urban neighborhoods in the United States, where most people didn't have a sukkah in tenements, you didn't have your own sukkah, so there'd be the only Sukkot people had access to were small Sukkot in the shul, in the synagogue. So men would go, women would stay home. Now that we live in, thank God, in big apartments with terraces, and our synagogue has a sukkah outside where 100 people can sit in at once, so men and women, sit in the sukkah together. Women perform that mitzvah even though they're not obligated in that mitzvah. And so there's a sort of a progression towards lessening the gender difference and refraining from constructing a philosophy of Jewish womanhood based on these, relatively small number of legal distinctions. That tends to be, I'm closer to that end of the spectrum, personally. We would also point to the fact that in Genesis, men and women are both created in the image of God and are both and are presented as being partners in all of the the callings of humanity to tend the world, to conquer the world, and to fill the world. I'd say the places where this is, to me, most, I'll say a few other things, though, more about it. So, the Torah is eternal. The Torah is for all time, but the Torah also had to make sense for the audience to which it was originally given. So, Maimonides, again, makes the point that animal sacrifices are in the Torah, and God doesn't really need animal sacrifices. God doesn't smell, the Greeks thought that the gods, really enjoy the smell of burning meat, and that's what you gave sacrifice. It fed the gods. The smell of whatever, all the burning meat was really wonderful. Like, the gods enjoyed it. So Maimonides understands that that's foolishness. So why does the Torah command us an animal sacrifice? So Maimonides writes, because back then, every religion that was known included animal sacrifices. And if we had been given a Torah that did not include animal sacrifices, nobody would have taken it seriously. What kind of religion is it that doesn't have animal sacrifices? So it's there in the Torah. So the Torah has, we sacrifice animals just to the one God, and we could give a monotheistic twist on animal sacrifices, but it's not because God needs it, not because it sort of aligns with the ultimate truth, but because the Torah also had to make sense to the audience to which it was originally given, and that's why it's there. So I think it's also worth noting that the Torah was given to a thoroughly patriarchal society where men had political power and financial power and power within families, and the Torah had to be acceptable to that type of society. And so the Torah also is, in certain ways, patriarchal, but the Torah also undermines that patriarchy by asserting that men and women are both created equally in the image of God, by including protections for women in the context of marriage and divorce, and by sort of affirming the value of female as well as male life, and giving men and women spiritual dignity through the opportunity to be in relationship to God and in community. The rabbis in the Talmudic era expanded on that, added increased protections for women, especially marriage and divorce, as they saw it was necessary to protect women more. So they expanded the idea of a ketubah, that a husband has to have a certain sizable amount of sum of money that's set aside, that belongs to his wife on the end of the marriage through death or divorce. And that's a way to protect women in a patriarchal world where unmarried women didn't necessarily have a means of support, and also was understood to be a barrier to divorce, right? You wouldn't be so quick to divorce your wife if you had to pay a lot of money. And that's also part of the rationale for ketubah. In the Middle Ages, the status of women was further enhanced by Rabbi Tam, one of the great, Rabbi Gershon, one of the great medieval German rabbis who outlawed polygamy. The Torah gives a grudging acceptance to polygamy, although if you read the Torah, it's clear it's a bad idea. I mean, no one ever does it because they want to, right? And it never really works out so well. But it is there as an institution that could exist in the Torah. Rabbi Gershon says, no, we can't do this anymore. And he also says that women have to accept divorce for a divorce good word, or a woman can refuse to accept a divorce, meaning a husband might have to negotiate and come to an agreement over divorce. A husband can no longer unilaterally divorce his wife, as the Torah will have allowed. So this is an ongoing process. The place where this is most acute for me is in the area of Torah scholarship. Torah scholarship until recently has been an endeavor engaging by men, with a few notable exceptions, right? Here and there we have records of female Torah scholars, one or two, three or four in the Talmudic period, a handful of stories in later Jewish history of women who were married to rabbis, or the daughters of great rabbis, or in some other way had access to strong Torah education and even taught Torah to circles of students. But by and large, 95%, 99% of Torah scholarship has been things written by men, for men, mostly about men as well. This has begun to change in recent years. When I say recent years, I mean very recent years. The first formal Jewish schools for girls are less than 200 years old. In Germany, and there was the Beis Yaakov movement, which was maybe 100 years ago, and the first schools where women were educated in Talmud in a sort of rigorous and thorough way. Those institutions opened in the 1970s. Okay? So in the scope of Jewish history, when you think of how many centuries we have been studying Torah, to think that the first formal schools or institutions where women could acquire a Talmudic education are only, so the first high school where women were taught Talmud. The first high schools where women were taught Talmud go back a little bit further. The first post-secondary institutes of Jewish learning where women could study Talmud opened in the 70s. And that movement has grown. There are now many more institutions, and it's possible for a woman to stay in those institutions for more and more years, to climb the ranks of Torah scholarship, but we're still, there's a huge education gap, and as a community we're struggling to find ways for women to professionalize their Torah scholarship and desire to teach Torah. That's very much a work in progress. Of all of these sort of issues of Jewish feminism, that's the one that to me is seems most acute, because Torah scholarship is so very crucial. But I don't know, in the last 10 years, a lot of changes has happened. Questions, comments, concerns, reactions to what I said? No? Everything good?
Actually, I do have a quick question.
Good, thank you.
You said divorce is a mitzvah?
Yeah, divorce is a mitzvah. So that's sort of a straight right. So a mitzvah doesn't necessarily mean something you have to do, but I guess the Torah does include mechanisms for divorce. It is a procedure, and it could be said to be a mitzvah, right? I mean, if one is divorcing, there's a way to do it in the Torah. So it's not an obligatory mitzvah. I guess it's if you do it, here's how you do it in the proper way. There's a story of the tell us of somebody who had a very close relationship with his ex-wife, and he used to refer to her as the woman who enabled him to fulfill the mitzvah of divorce. That's unconventional, right? So, not all mitzvot are obligatory. Some mitzvot are if you do it, you fulfill the mitzvah. It's not an obligatory mitzvah. There are a few others. Other questions? Mashiach. I took a semester in graduate school on Messianism and Jewish thought and Jewish history. So, trying what to say in 5-10 minutes, summarize a semester. So, the word Mashiach means anointed. In the Bible, kings of Israel and the high priests were anointed with oil. I assume that means the oil was poured on their heads or dabbed on their heads as a way of giving them this special status. The Tanakh, Hebrew Bible, tells us that when King David became king, he was promised that he would be his household would endure in its monarchical, in its kingship, for all time. And this was alluded to even earlier in the Torah, in Genesis, when Jacob is blessing his children, his love to Sor Shevet Yehudah, that the scepter should not depart from Judah, that kingship shall reside in the tribe of Judah. So once David of the tribe of Judah became king, kingship endures in his family forever. Now, what happened? If you recall, after David dies, his son Solomon reigns. After Solomon reigns, his son Rehoboam reigns. Rehoboam, though, is not a very clever king, and he imposes too hard taxes, and he isn't very flexible as a ruler, and he sparks a rebellion. And the 10 northern tribes break away and have their own kingdom. The kingdom of Judah endures as a smaller kingdom for several more centuries, but eventually, 586 BCE, the Babylonians come in, and that's the end of the kingdom of Judah. The Persians come in, and they give permission for the Jews to return to Jerusalem, to rebuild Jerusalem. And Zerubbabel is a descendant of this Davidic family, and he rules very, very briefly in Jerusalem, and then he kind of gets pushed off the stage. And from that point on, we no longer have a Jewish king from the line of David. We do seem to have members of that royal family exerting power in Babylonia. There's a position called the Exilarch, or the Reish Galuta, who was sort of like an important political person for the Jews living in exile in Babylonia, who was from this Davidic family, according to tradition. So for another 1,000 years in Babylonia, you had members of this royal family exerting power, which probably means this family had some power for longer than any other dynasty that we know of, or almost any other dynasty that we know of in history, or one of the top ones. But there's no Davidic king ruling in Israel. We have the Persians are in charge, and then you have eventually the Greeks come in. You have the Hasmoneans, the Maccabees, have a little kingdom. The Maccabees, that were not from the tribe of Judah, they appoint themselves as king, and they say, we're just waiting until a king from the Davidic family will make himself known, in which case we'll abdicate, but until then we're ruling, in his, as sort of, what do you call it? Like regents, okay? So in this period, you have the idea develops that where eventually there'll be a king from the Davidic line, the rightful ruler will return and rule, and you have lots of writings from this period of history developing the idea further. Furthermore, all of the various prophecies of the First Temple period, Isaiah, and Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, become associated with this return of Mashiach, of the anointed king from the line of David. And some of those prophecies speak of return to sovereignty to the Jewish people, the return of the exiles to the land of Israel, and some of those prophecies speak of a much broader, more dramatic transformation of human nature. Human nature will be transformed, and the world will be transformed. The lion will, and the sheep will, will sleep together, whatever. We'll lay down together. I think Woody Allen said, the lion and the sheep may lay down together, but the sheep isn't going to get a lot of sleep. So in the rabbinic period, you have a development of these ideas in kind of two directions. You have a trend that says, really there will be nothing different about the Messianic age other than sovereignty will return to Israel. That's it. Everything will be the same, but sovereignty will return to Israel. We'll have independence in our own land. And you have other opinions saying, no, all of the, and in which case, what are these dramatic transformations described in the prophets? Those are not describing Yemot HaMashiach, the days of the Messianic reign. Those are describing, like, the world to come, something far beyond, like the end of history, or even describing, like, the life of the soul after death, but not describing the Messianic age. Other sources say, no, those transformative prophecies are, in fact, describing the Messianic age itself. And so these are two opinions in the Talmud, and two opinions that played themselves out later in Jewish history, later in Jewish thought, and with thinkers on both sides. What's the role of this idea of Mashiach in Jewish thinking? On the one hand, Messianic movements, as they've occurred in Jewish history, meaning the identification of a particular person, like this is the Mashiach, and kind of rallying around that person. This has happened numerous times in Jewish history, and it's always been a terrible disaster. Really, Messianic movements have been among the most dangerous things that happen in Jewish history, most destructive things that have happened. The most notorious, three really notorious Messianic movements. One, you have Bar Kokhba, who rebelled against the Romans, led a rebellion against the Romans, a generation or two generations after the destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans. Romans destroyed the temple in the year 70. Bar Kokhba organizes a massive, massive rebellion against the Romans during the time of the Emperor Hadrian, and Rabbi Akiva, one of the greatest rabbis of that time, identified Bar Kokhba, says this is the Mashiach, and the result was terrible, terrible devastation for the Jews. I mean, and the Romans had to fight. The Romans were devastated also. In fact, what Roman history records, when there was some like formula that the Roman emperor would say, maybe the general would say when he was reporting back to the Senate, he would say, sort of like a State of the Union address. He would say something like the legions are well, something like that. There was some like kind of standard. He left it out that year, right? Things were so bad. It was a really very, very bloody fight. A major Roman army had to go to quell the rebellion, but the result was really devastation in Jewish communities in the land of Israel. Another major Messianic movement was the movement around Shabtai Tzvi, who in 1660-something, 1666 I believe, announces himself as a Messiah, and Jews all over the world are super excited and sell off their possessions, sell their businesses, sell their furniture to get ready to move to Israel. Shabtai Tzvi then goes to meet the Sultan to present his demands for return of the Jews to Israel under his kingship. The Sultan threatens to kill him unless he becomes a Muslim, and Shabtai Tzvi does. So this alone would have been pretty devastating for the thousands and thousands of Jews who supported him. It became worse because many of them refused to believe that his mission was a failure, and they said no. He became a Muslim he went undercover. He did this as part of this Kabbalistic. He was a Kabbalist, right? And they said that all of the sparks have been repaired, all of the tikkun, all of this repairing has happened. Remember I mentioned that earlier, and all that remains is the sparks that are sunk, in Islam. Meaning you have to descend into this other foreign religion in order to find the sparks there and elevate them so that this edifice in heaven can be repaired. And so they developed a whole theology in which Shabtai Tzvi's conversion to Islam was part of his messianic mission, and this became a really deeply problematic heresy. It got even worse a generation or two later with a fellow named Jacob Frank, who thought that all of us should engage in sins of the worst kind in order to elevate the sparks that are hidden in those forbidden activities. And so that included eating non-kosher food, it included violating the Sabbath, and it even included sexual sins and orgies and adultery, all as a way of bringing this messianic redemption. So really terrible, terrible devastation. I would say it's possible to it's possible as well to understand Christianity as a Jewish messianic movement. It seems that although it's hard to speak. I mean, there's so little that's known. That's known. Contemporary sources. So, but it's it seems from the New Testament that Jesus excited a lot of created a lot of excitement amongst his followers, caused a lot of tumult, which is why the Romans were so anxious, because they were worried about Messiah. There were a lot of Messiah figures emerging in the time of Jesus, who were trying to overthrow Roman rule and lead this Jewish Renaissance. So on the one hand, messianic movements have been truly destructive. Like one of the most destructive phenomena in Jewish history. On the other hand, belief in Mashiach, that there will be this restoration, that the system, that the full observance and allegiance to the Torah, and all of the mitzvot, and the building of the temple, and this life in proximity to God, and the gathering of the exiles, the belief in that is an orienting point for Jewish life. It tells us what we're moving towards. It tells us that history has a happy ending, and it's a source of solace and comfort and faith, and again orients our religious life and our sort of activities. This is what we're building towards. This is what we're yearning towards. And so some of those two poles, are kind of have to be balanced. This belief in Mashiach, yearning for Mashiach, yearning for redemption as an orienting point of Jewish spiritual and practical life, and on the other hand, a recognition that messianic movements in the past and in the present even have been terribly, terribly destructive. Questions, comments, concerns?
How many people do you think actually believe that someone will eventually come?
How many?
Yeah, what percentage would you say?
43%. I don't know. I'm not sure. I think it can. I really have no idea what percentage. Well, it's a very interesting question. I don't think there's been much polling on this.
Mm-hmm. This is something a lot of people talk about, but then on an individual basis, people say, "Oh no, it's just."
Look, you had in the non-Orthodox movements, people speak of a messianic age rather than Mashiach, which is sort of a way of depersonalizing or demythologizing, make it more rational. I think you sort of lose something if you kind of take the whole thing into just a symbol. On the other hand, I think the way it functions in our religious life is maybe more symbolic. Does that make sense? Right? I think if you say it's not a real person, it's just an idea, then I think the idea itself loses power. I think the way it functions in our religious life is more of as an idea. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Does that make sense to anyone else? Okay, thank you. That's very kind. There's a teacher, a writer, a sort of public intellectual in the Orthodox community, his name's Rabbi Karmi, who told a story that that when his mother was dying, he had occasion to read the notes that the hospital's social worker or therapist took when speaking to his mother. Right? She was dying in the hospital. There was some social worker or therapist or somebody at the hospital who had a few conversations with his mother, and she did notes. And he had occasion to look at this person's notes. And the professional was surprised that this dying woman, who purports to be very religious, didn't seem to be particularly concerned about what happened to her soul after death. That wasn't a major preoccupation for her, which was shocking to this professional. I think though, from somebody who has lived a Jewish life and actually been involved in Jewish religious life in an intense way, I don't think it's so shocking at all, because yes, we believe in a soul that lives on after we die, and we do, that is part of Jewish belief, but it's not a highly prioritized focus of our thought and attention. So I think when you're evaluating beliefs, I think there are two axes or two arenas which you have to evaluate. One is, what is the belief, the content of the belief, and the other is the importance of that belief. So I think Rabbi Carmeli's late mother, I think, indeed, right? Like, yes, Jews believe in that a soul survives after, but in Jewish life, it's a lower priority belief. It's not a major focus, right? A major focus, we have so much to do. We have Torah to learn, we have mitzvot to perform, we have good to do in the world. That's the focus of our religious life and our spiritual life. So I think it's really important. So I think that's another like angle at your question. I think belief in Mashiach is like core to Judaism. I think it might for many people be a lower priority belief in the scheme of like things we think about and worry about and focus upon in our religious lives. Okay. Questions, comments? Okay, it's actually pretty late now, so we will, let's pause. We can schedule the next class. The next class is going to begin the syllabus all from the beginning, so it's a great place to join. If you know people who you think might be interested in coming, you should encourage them to do so. Let's see. When's the next one going to be there? Let's see, next Tuesday is the 19th, I can't make the 19th, and I can't make the 26th, I'm sorry. So that leaves us with June 2nd. So June 2nd, we can either do 7 o'clock, or we can do, but then it'll be, but 7 to 8? Is that okay? Yeah, no? What?
That's great.
Because Mincha's not going to start until 8:05. So we wouldn't be able, the earliest, if we do after Marav, the earliest starting time would be like 8:45, which is a little bit late, I think. So let's okay.
So June 2nd, 7 p.m.
Sorry, what?
June 2nd.
June 2nd at 7 p.m. Okay, have a great night. Of course.
Actually, I have a couple questions, but then
Sure.
I also
Oh, wonderful. How'd that go?